न सद्वासद्यदपि परमं वेदवातन्न वेद यत् सत्यं तन्न खलु कुशलैश्छिद्यते तर्कबाणैः द्वैताद्वैतात्यखिलमतिभिर्यत्पदं सेव्यते तत् वन्दे चेतो विलयनिलयं शारदापादपद्मम् सांख्यं योगं पशुपतिमतं वैष्णवं वा यथेच्छं चार्वाकं वा भवतु हृदयाह्लादकं सज्जनानां यत् सत्यं तत् प्रमितिपथगं स्वप्रकाशं वरेण्यं दद्याच्छौख्यं जगति सकलं darshanam sharadaya. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Lyon, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. All right, let me just share my screen here. How's that looking for everyone? Do you see my slides? Perfect, great. All right, yeah, so thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to give this presentation. This is very new work, and it's also one of the most unusual projects I've ever worked on. So I'm very keen to get your feedback and your input on what we're doing. Before I get into it, first of all, I'll just give a bit of an overview of the talk. First, I'm going to give a background on, so this talk is going to be primarily about a philosophical methodology issue. But for me to explain that, I have to give you some background on a larger philosophical and scientific project that I'm working on. So we're going to cover that background material in section 1, and I'll tell you a bit about myself as well, because I think that'll help you understand where we're coming from for this work. Then we'll get into the philosophical methodology that I just mentioned, and then that should be section 3, not section 4. We're going to discuss what we're calling peace and the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis. I promise you that'll make sense by the time we get to that section. We'll go through a summary, and then I have some questions for you to see if maybe you can point us in the right direction about a few specific issues that we have. Okay, so a little bit about me first. So I currently live in Amsterdam, but I grew up surfing in Australia. And after I was finally done surfing, I earned undergraduate degrees in mathematics and philosophy, as well as a PhD in the philosophy of uncertainty. And much of my research has been about how we can use a mixture of mathematics, philosophy, and psychology to improve decision-making in the face of deep uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that arises when you've got no data, no models, and the experts disagree. Alongside my research career, I've also worked as a risk management consultant, and I help large organizations make huge decisions in the face of this kind of uncertainty, deep uncertainty. And because of what I do is so topic neutral, I've actually worked with clients in all sorts of domains, including biosecurity analysis with the Australian government, geopolitical forecasting with the intelligence community in Washington, D.C., and institutional investment in Singapore, as well as all sorts of other things, including psychedelic therapy. And in fact, that brings me to my next point. So about 10 years ago, my career took a hard left turn from all this risk management probability type stuff into psychedelics research. And that's now increasingly becoming a mainstream topic as the evidence for the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics continues to mount. This change in research focus also involved an expansion to include spiritual practices such as meditation and yoga. And indeed, last year I published my book, Psychedelic Experience Revealing the Mind, in which I argue that we can have psychedelic experiences without consuming psychedelic substances. In particular, I argued that various meditative practices often give rise to psychedelic experiences, understood as revelations of something hidden in the mind, and where the mind here is it's broadly construed. So the term psychedelic comes from the Greek words psyche and delos, and we can interpret psyche to be mind, but it's also often sometimes interpreted to be self or soul or spirit. We'll say neutral with respect to that. And the idea is that what these experiences that people typically attribute to psychedelics are really mind-revealing experiences, and they can be had without taking psychedelics. Taking psychedelics is just one way that a lot of people may come to know about these experiences. Okay, so I'm now working here at Leiden University, here in the Netherlands, as a principal investigator for the Mystical Entropy Project. This is funded by the John Templeton Foundation and hosted by the PRISM Lab at Leiden University in collaboration with Professor Michael van Elk. PRISM stands for Psychedelic, Religious, Spiritual, and Mystical. And so the lab investigates the sort of neuroscience and cognitive psychology of those experiences, as well as their relationship to human well-being. The main idea of the Mystical Entropy Project is twofold. First, recent neuroscientific research into psychedelics indicates these interventions in the brain tend to increase its entropy, which we may intuitively understood as the mind's understood as an increase and unpredictability of neural activity of the brain. The second one is that many of the world's spiritual practices appear to be designed specifically to increase what we may call the mind's entropy, which can be intuitively understood as the mind's suppleness or flexibility. For example, many meditative practices help the mind slow down, relax, and let go, thus allowing for authentic novelty to arise naturally. The insight driving the project is that these two observations are likely two different sides of the same coin. Indeed, this idea arises as a natural extension of the main idea of my book, that psychedelics and meditation are two ways of bringing about the same kinds of experiences. So the task now in the Mystical Entropy Project is to make this connection more precise and convert it from a philosophical observation, or paraphilosophical observations, into some kind of actionable, testable knowledge. And so part of our research has been to look to the world's spiritual traditions for entropy-like concepts that may help us advance the science of psychedelics and meditation. And the hope is that by doing so, we'll have a better understanding of what is happening in the mind, brain, body during these experiences and practices. So in our review, we've found two broad categories of entropy-like concepts across various spiritual traditions. These two broad categories correspond to a familiar distinction in spirituality, that of yin-yang, Shiva-Shakti, Prakriti, Purusha, or Advaita Tantra. That's sort of that common duality that we see arise all over the place. The two broad categories also happen to align with the two main conceptualizations of entropy that have emerged in science over the centuries. These have become known as entropy as uncertainty from information theory, and entropy as disorder from thermodynamics. Perhaps the most famous example of the first category is beginner's mind in Zen. So roughly speaking, as you cultivate a beginner's mind, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to not know things, to allow to be uncertain. And as you do that, awareness expands and purifies itself. We can see the same idea in many other traditions. It's not just in Zen. So for example, in Christian mysticism, there's the cloud of unknowing that one must pass through to unify with God or to know God. Okay, so as I mentioned, before I became interested in the psychedelic mystical research, my area of expertise was exactly this, philosophy uncertainty, deep uncertainty, exactly the kind of uncertainty that we would associate with beginner's mind. So that's been a fascinating coincidence for me personally. And indeed, I'd love to talk about that stuff today, but we don't have much time. And I really want to talk to you about that second category. Okay, so perhaps the most famous example of the second category is Kundalini and Tantric yoga. And that's what I'd like to discuss today. Now that connection may not be obvious, so I'm going to have to unpack it in detail, since it's crucial for the rest of the sections for this presentation. Okay, so if you think about it, the word disorder is interestingly ambiguous. It could mean the lack of order in the sense of things being messy and chaotic, but it could also mean disorder as in psychological disorder or dysfunction, which is more about having the wrong kind of order. Having the wrong kind of order can involve messiness and chaos, but it can also involve the exact opposite, sterility and rigidity. To illustrate, two examples of psychological disorders that we can characterize in this way are substance addiction and obsessive compulsive behavior. These are the sorts of conditions that would be characterized in many traditions in terms of energy being stuck, or prana that isn't flowing freely and functionally. And interestingly, psychedelics have been observed to treat many conditions of exactly this nature, such as addiction and obsessive-compulsive behavior. So this dual nature of disorder also appears in the form of two common applications of entropy in physics, the first in fundamental physics and the second in applied physics. The first in fundamental physics is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that, roughly speaking, the entropy of a closed system tends to increase over time. And an intuitive example is what happens when you put sugar in tea, or when an ice block melts in the sun. A system that's ordered becomes more disordered over time, in this sense of becoming messy and chaotic. The second application, the one in applied physics or engineering, concerns engine design. If you want to make an engine, you have to figure out how to convert some source of energy into some source of work. For example, a truck's engine converts gasoline into forward movement. Now, obviously, some engines perform better than others in that they are more efficient in their conversion from energy to work. They waste less energy by generating less heat, friction, noise, etc. Energy waste occurs because of poor engine design, which is another way of saying poor engine order. Improve the order and you get more of what you want. Now, that last idea is common to many spiritual traditions with philosophical systems that recognize some form of subtle energy, such as prana in Hinduism. Indeed, it can be helpful to think of ourselves as like spiritual engines, converting some energy source into action, behavior, creativity, experience, consciousness, and so on. And while these traditions may differ in their approaches for improving the order of one's spiritual tradition, they generally agree that if the order is improved, then energy flows more freely and functionally. Some traditions also recognize an initially latent source of energy of one's spiritual engine. This latent energy is known as Kundalini in Tantric yoga, but she also appears elsewhere, such as Tummo in Vajrayana Buddhism. Both traditions recognize the femininity of this energy. Tummo literally means fierce woman, and while Kundalini means coiled serpent, this is only in the dormant phase. The rising of Kundalini is considered a manifestation of divine feminine energy, often referred to as Shakti in Hindu traditions, and this rising is a manifestation of Prakriti, the dynamic creative aspect of the universe, which stands in contrast to Purusha, the pure consciousness aspect. Okay, so central to all of this is the notion of a chakra, a kind of energy vortex that Kundalini can enter and rise through. However, what often prevents Kundalini from rising is some kind of blockage or imbalance in the chakra system. And so we get to the central idea of this talk. It is what I call the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis. The experiential and therapeutic effects of various psychedelics can be understood scientifically in terms of alterations to one's chakra system. In some cases, these alterations allow for Kundalini to rise. In other cases, they may just alter her manifestation. So before I continue, I want to quickly flag an important issue. I could have instead advanced what I might call the psychedelic Tummo hypothesis, borrowing from the Vajrayana tradition. However, I'm more familiar with Tantric yoga, and I'm not even that familiar with Tantric yoga in the first place, but I'm more familiar with it than with Tummo. And so we're going to work within that framework for now, and we'll come back to this point later on, actually. So the basic idea is that we can usefully analyze the effects of various psychedelics in terms of their differential activations of the chakras. The thought is that each substance has its own distinctive chakra profile. And that chakra profile is like a genetic code, in that it plays a substantial but not definitive role in influencing the nature of the experience one has on a psychedelic. Just as we see the effects of our genes interacting with our environment, we should also be able to see the effects of our altered chakra profiles interacting with our environments during psychedelic experiences. So interestingly, we have some data to support this hypothesis. But before I get into that, I think it would help to just work through some intuitive examples. For example, the drug DMT is known to regularly induce intense mental imagery, profound intuitions, and spiritual or metaphysical insights. These are qualities typically associated with activation of ajna, or the third eye chakra. DMT is also known to cause breakthrough experiences in which individuals become one with existence, a quality associated with the crown chakra, or perhaps the bliss kosha, and we'll come back to that later on as well. So not surprisingly, DMT has become colloquially known as the spirit molecule. To take another example, the drug MDMA is known to regularly induce heightened experiences of pleasure, love, empathy, trust, and compassion. It is often used in social or party contexts and known colloquially as ecstasy, the party drug, and of course the love drug. Intuitively, these qualities correspond to substantial activations of the Svadhisthana and Anahata chakras, or the sacral and heart chakras, for pleasure and love, respectively, roughly speaking, of course. To take a third fun example, ketamine is known to function regularly as a dissociative in the sense that it's used for pain relief, which would appear to be a deactivation of the lower chakras. Okay, so these are just common intuitions that people have about the effects of these substances. Now, we don't need to rely on those intuitions, though. As part of our empirical research, we've found some initial data that backs these intuitions. Using artificial intelligence, we've analyzed thousands of publicly available trip reports on a website called erowid.org, and we found that there are distinctive chakra activations associated with the different reports of different drugs. For example, here is one of the first graphs we were able to produce using these new techniques. As you can see, this initial analysis allowed us to show distinct patterns in chakra activations and deactivations across different substances. So let me just explain what's going on here a little bit. Remember I mentioned that DMT is the spirit molecule? Well, that's this the purple line here. You can see that there's activations for all the chakras above 0, but the most activation is around the ajna, third eye and crown chakras. MDMA, it scores highest on the heart chakra, in line with the intuition that it is the love drug. It also, as we can see, scores quite high on the sacral chakra, in line with the idea that it's also used for pleasure, sensuality, emotions, and this sort of thing. As I mentioned also, ketamine is a dissociative. We'd expect it to knock out the lower chakras, and indeed this is what we seem to find, a deactivation of more of the body chakras relative to the head chakras. The other drug here, the yellow curve, is 2CB, and this is interesting because it's a designer drug designed by the famous chemist Alexander Shulgin, who wanted to combine the effects of a psychedelic, a bit like DMT, and the effects of an MDMA into sort of the ultimate sort of scientist drug, the sort of drug that would help a scientist have to use the intuition and wisdom afforded by ajna activation, but it's still a pleasant, enjoyable experience stemming from the activation of the sacral chakra. Okay. So there's one more empirical point I'd like to make before we get to the philosophical methodology, which is that many of our standard psychometric tools for understanding these experiences looks very biased from this chakra-based perspective. When we look at which chakras our psychometric questions tend to focus on, there is a clear bias towards the head chakras and away from the body ones. So for example, here is a graph showing the number of questions, these are also known as items, on a survey known as the 11D ASC. This means the 11-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire. So it's a questionnaire of about 45 questions, if I remember correctly. And these are the question counts per chakra that we see. So there, as you can see, there's a lot of focus on, particularly on the two top chakras, ajna and crown, and particularly less on the body ones, and particularly the heart and sacral chakras. Moreover, when we look at the questions associated with the root chakra, they tend to be mostly concerned about safety, security, and threats. So they're often framed in negative valence, whereas the head chakras items tend to be framed in terms of positive valence. So by looking at our kind of Western psychometric scales from this perspective, from this different perspective, we can see that our scales may have an important blind spot to them. And this is really important because this blind spot is also exactly where so much healing happens, in those lower chakras. So to put it another way, as scientists, how can we possibly understand the therapeutic effects of psychedelics if we're barely looking at the body, at those lower chakras? Indeed, this is especially pertinent because what we do know about psychedelics is that they can treat conditions or often involve transformations that specifically relate to the lower chakras, such as disconnection of nature with the root chakra, substance addiction with the sacral chakra, depression and anxiety with the solar, and disconnection from other people in the heart, just to name a few examples. We know that psychedelics they appear to stand out at being effectively good at treating those conditions, and yet our ways of measuring these altered states of consciousness seem to miss all of that activity. Okay, so I've just presented some of the phenomenological evidence of the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis. Our next step here at Leiden is to see if we can observe neuroimaging evidence in favor of it. So over the next few months, we're going to be conducting fMRI scans of experienced yogis meditating on different chakras. And if we get the results we expect, we will then have two independent lines of evidence for this psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis. There's so much more to say about all this, obviously, but I think that gives you an overall sense of what we're trying to achieve with this mystical entropy project. To summarize the key idea, according to various spiritual traditions with energetic frameworks, many problems that humans struggle with involve prana being stuck or flowing in some dysfunctional way. And it appears that psychedelics may treat these problems by breaking up that dysfunctional order, thereby temporarily increasing entropy and chaos, but then allowing the spiritual engine to reorganize itself afterward into a more functional configuration. Okay, so that's a lot real fast. And what we're going to do now is we're going to slow way down and dig into the philosophical methodology behind all of this. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is an unusual project, and I get all sorts of questions from all sorts of people. Skeptical scientists say that the chakras are not real, and this is all religious nonsense and should be kept out of science. At the other extreme, many serious yogis will say that what we're talking about is extraordinarily powerful and needs to be handled with great care. We're playing with fire, so to speak, really big fire. And somewhere in the middle, practitioners from other traditions complain that we're using the popularized system of 7 chakras, which isn't real or nearly as good as the chakra system of their preferred tradition. We also have our own meta concern with the project. How exactly do we justify the assumptions we're making? Normally, when we make an assumption, we would appeal to logical arguments or scientific evidence. However, in this domain of inquiry, the rules appear to be different. For example, one might argue that we should justify our assumptions using ancient sacred texts. Others might argue that we should look to our own inner truth, arriving at through practice or psychedelics or whatever. And of course, the skeptical scientists will say that we can do whatever we want, but it won't mean anything unless our hypotheses are stated in clear scientific terminology and pass robust statistical tests. Now, since we have analytical philosophers involved in this project, of course, we have responses to all of these concerns. However, before I get into those details, I think it is important to note that there is important wisdom behind each one of them. All these perspectives, the scientist, the yogi, those taking other paths, all see something important, and they often see something that the others cannot see. And so we would like our work to be useful for everyone, but we want it to be accessible to all these people, or as many people as possible. And so we need to lay out an inclusive philosophical framework that can accommodate and integrate these diverse perspectives. Such a framework is needed because it allows us to systematically integrate different methodological approaches, ensuring that our research is comprehensive, well-rounded, and deeply informed by both ancient wisdom and modern science. All right, so this is where my brilliant co-author, Professor Anand Vaidya at San Jose State University comes in. While I've been messing around with drugs and chakras, he was doing hard, serious philosophical work developing a framework for exactly the kind of research that we're doing, which he called cross-cultural conceptual engineering. And Anand calls this the ACE framework for cross-cultural engineering. ACE stands for analytic, comparative, and empirical. So let's dive into these real quick. First, let's talk about the analytic component. Philosophy has always thrived on clarity, rigor, and precise reasoning. And analytic philosophy does this by dissecting complex concepts, clarifying terms, and systematically testing our intuitions. By engaging in careful logical analysis, we uncover hidden assumptions, identify inconsistencies, and refine our understanding of the world. This process is akin to sharpening a tool, making it more effective for the task at hand. So any kind of project along these lines needs to have a strong analytic component. The second component is the comparative component. And this is where we broaden our horizons, stepping away from the confines of our own cultural and philosophical traditions. And so by comparing insights from different traditions, we can uncover universal truths and unique perspectives that enrich our understanding. This comparative work is essential for addressing biases in philosophical inquiry, a bit like the biases that I just mentioned. This comparative work, it reminds us that this wisdom is not a monopoly of any one culture of ours. Instead, it's a tapestry woven of diverse threads of human experience. And then finally, the empirical component brings scientific rigor into the mix. This involves engaging with data and findings from the sciences, cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, and beyond. Empirical methods allow us to test our hypotheses, gather evidence, and validate our theories. This is crucial for bridging the gap between philosophical speculation and practical real-world applications. So we can think of these three components as forming as a triangle, a way of triangulating in on the truth. And as such, a project like the Mystical Entry Project needs to account for all three criteria. It needs to be analytically sound. Concepts are defined precisely and systematically. It's comparatively sound. The wisdom of other traditions is treated respectfully. And it should be empirically sound. The resulting ideas are empirically verified at some point. And so the ACE framework is a call for a more holistic and inclusive approach to philosophy, recognizing that combining different methodologies can lead to a deeper and more accurate understanding of philosophical issues. The ACE framework was designed for cross-cultural engineering in general, for both spiritual and non-spiritual traditions. This is crucial because philosophical and spiritual understanding is not merely an intellectual understanding. Sorry, I mixed things up. So, as we thought about how we were going to apply this framework, the ACE framework, to our Mystical Entry project, we realized that there was a few components missing given the spiritual nature of the project. And so we decided that there were two more components that we need to add to the ACE framework. The first is practice. So engagement with disciplined regular practices within the tradition and community or lineage that we're studying or comparing our own to. This is crucial because philosophical and spiritual understanding is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is a lived experience and only fragments of it can be represented in books. More of a disciplined practice is extremely important when dealing with powerful phenomena such as psychedelics and Kundalini. And so a project such as this needs to be grounded in some way in practice. The next component that we thought that we needed to add is experience. So in order to get to the next two components, analyze and compare, one needs to have an experiential understanding of those concepts. And this is so often the case with spiritual traditions. The relevant concepts require an experiential understanding of them. It is not enough to know about the concepts, one has to know them directly. For example, consider the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. One can maybe point to it and guide others towards it, but it has to be experienced to be known. You can't speak about it directly. So extending the ACE framework for cross-cultural conceptual engineering between spiritual traditions, we get what we're calling the peace framework. The peace framework emphasizes the importance of disciplined practice and experiential understanding, in addition to the analytic, comparative, and empirical approaches. Moreover, these feed into each other. So practice, for example, lays the groundwork for experience by providing disciplined routines and rituals that open the mind and body to new insights, and also by providing an appropriate container for them. Experience enriches analysis by offering first-hand intuitive understanding of concepts and phenomena, which sharpens and informs logical reflection. Analysis enhances the comparison by clearly defining and Analysis enhances comparison by clearly defining concepts and assumptions, making it easier to identify similarities and differences across the traditions. And the comparison informs the empirical investigation by highlighting diverse perspectives and hypotheses that then can be tested and validated through scientific methods. And then on the experimental or empirical side, that can then validate and refine practice, creating a feedback loop where scientific findings inform and enhance spiritual philosophical methods. Thus, we see the dynamic, creative nature of the peace framework. The positive feedback loop, this kind of flywheel effect, ensures that whatever we're doing actually stays alive. Practice constantly evolves, and science relentlessly tests hypotheses. And by bringing these two into contact, we're able to create something that is genuinely new, customized and empirically validated energetic frameworks for today's cultures and societies. All right, I actually really want to pause here and really highlight this point, because concerning the philosophical methodology, it's an important point to understand what we're doing and how our project may be criticized or evaluated and ways we might try to improve it. So one kind of snappy way of thinking about it is that this dynamic nature of the peace framework also reflects the dynamic nature of Kundalini. But let me express that again in the language of regular philosophy. Our project is one of conceptual engineering. And what do I mean by conceptual engineering? Well, for a long time, especially in the 20th century, but consistent with the history of Western philosophy, there has been a project known as conceptual analysis. Roughly, this is the project of saying what something is, in part by saying what the analysis of that concept is. For example, Plato's view of knowledge is that it's justified true belief. That's an analysis of knowledge based on reflection on whether knowledge is present in specific cases or not. Conceptual analysis is about saying what a pre-existing concept is. So for example, we may want to say what a chakra is and define that. That would be analyzing the concept of a chakra. By contrast, conceptual engineering is about changing or creating a concept in order to play a role. For example, many thinkers now hold that the concept of marriage is a concept that has been engineered over time to be more inclusive of who can be married. That's an example of conceptual change. Another example of engineering would be the introduction of a new concept. For example, the introduction of a genetic code in science. That was a new concept. These are examples of conceptual engineering. So what we are investigating in this project is whether we can define the concept of a chakra precisely enough and systematically enough in the language of science so that we can formulate testable hypotheses and better understand and harness the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, meditation, yoga, and so on. So to do this, we have to look deeply at historical texts that discuss Kundalini, the chakras, and so on, and the theories and commentaries given by authors who have written on these. However, at the same time, in the service of advancing science and therapeutic applications of psychedelics, meditation, and so on, we aim to engineer concepts to suit today's cultures and societies. Thus, cross-cultural conceptual engineering is conceptual engineering that respectfully learns from different cultures to achieve a specified purpose, creating something new for our culture today. It's not cultural appropriation because it gives us due credit to the sources, and it explicitly claims to engineer something new that didn't exist before. So this is really important. We're building something new, not merely studying something old. And our purpose is to advance the psychedelic and meditative sciences so that we can use these and related therapeutic interventions on the mind, brain, body more effectively and systematically. So the peace framework gives us a way of doing this by respecting the wisdom of all traditions involved, from the spiritual, that would be the practice and experience, to the philosophical, that would be the analysis and comparison stages, and in the scientific, that would be the experimental, the empirical. Okay, so let's just go through how we're doing that with the Peace Project. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the Mystical Entropy Project, we sought out entropy-like concepts in the world's spiritual traditions to see if they could inform the science of psychedelics and meditation. And we found some potential candidates in all over the place, but in particular Kundalini Yoga. This is a clear instance of the comparative approach, which broadens the scope of philosophical inquiry by incorporating diverse cultural and intellectual traditions. We're going beyond what we normally do in cognitive psychology. However, to truly understand these traditions, it's not enough to simply read about them. One must engage sincerely in their practices. And so, for instance, I've practiced meditation for many years and yoga for a few years as well. And Anand and I both have amazing teachers who occasionally are able to give us guidance. So this commitment to practice is essential. And through our practices, we acquire various experiences which inform our analyses. For example, we've experimented with defining chakra kosha intersections. I'll come back to that in a moment. Doing this requires at least some experiential understanding of these concepts. Additionally, our data also includes first-hand experiential reports from others. Remember I said we were analyzing the trip reports that people have written about their psychedelic experiences. Those are all first-person experiences, reported, just written as a description. So it's not just our experiences that play a role, but also the experiences of others. And this illustrates the experiential component of the peace framework. Okay, let's go to the analytic. So consider that intuition that I gave you before, that DMT is the spirit molecule or MDMA is the love party drug. These slogans capture common intuitions about these substances based on people's reflections on their experiences. Breaking down the Ajna chakra into associations such as vision or mental imagery, intuition, insight, wisdom is an analytic task. And when we notice a potential similarity between, for example, Ajna activation and a DMT experience, we engage in both analysis and comparison across the traditions. And in this particular project, we've taken it a step further and we've used artificial intelligence techniques to automate our analyses of these thousands of first-person experiences. And finally, we incorporate the empirical component to the peace framework For example, we found phenomenological evidence that aligns with the common intuition that DMT is the spirit molecule and MDMA is the love and party drug. And as another example, over the next few months, we'll be conducting a neuroimaging study at the PRISM lab to find the neural correlates of chakra meditations, providing further empirical evidence that will either confirm or disconfirm the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis. Okay, so let me just do a quick summary and then we'll get to the questions that we have for you. So in summary, our research into the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis showcases the practical and theoretical benefits of the peace framework. This framework allows us to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science. By applying the peace framework, we honor the wisdom of the world's spiritual traditions while integrating the insights afforded by this wisdom into rigorous scientific inquiry. This approach offers a holistic path forward, recognizing the necessity for disciplined practice and personal experience as the foundation of genuine understanding, the value of balancing analytic rigor and philosophical openness, and the importance of empirical validation. We've used the example of the psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis as an example of the peace framework in action, but we also think the peace framework can serve as a guide for other projects seeking to harmonize traditional wisdom with modern science. All right, and now I'll quickly get to the questions that we have. So the reason why I'm posing these questions is because, as you can see, the perspective that we're coming from means that we're not familiar with these traditions. But what we're looking to do is to increase the conceptual precision of the concepts that we're using so that we can better deploy them in our scientific hypotheses. So this involves thinking more carefully and going more into the details of the underlying philosophical system. For example, although I discussed the standard 7-chakra system, in the spirit of the peace conceptual engineering framework, I looked at alternatives. For example, I chopped each chakra up into 3 sub-chakras. So instead of 7 chakras, we'd have 3 for each one. And we can think of this as breaking them up into lower, middle, and upper chakras. So for example, you might think that something like, if ajna, something like intuition maybe could be considered lower ajna, and something like insight could be considered upper ajna. So when we looked at that, we got different kinds of results, and we started to notice some interesting patterns. We also looked at reframing the question. So far we've been asking so for a given experience, which chakras, what's the activation of all the chakras given the description of the experience? For these graphs, what we did was we got the AI to analyze the text and answer the question, which chakra was most distinctively activated during the peak experience of this drug? And so we get some very clean results here. For example, DMT, it was robustly chakra 6, ajna, or a little bit higher, involving some of chakra 7. LSD is more around chakra 5, but you can also see the variance is higher there, meaning that its effects are more varied than DMT. And then, of course, MDMA is very tightly anchored on chakra 4, the heart chakra. As I mentioned, we started to make things even more complex. So motivated by some of the patterns we were looking at or observing, we thought it looked like that maybe what we need to be doing, or we may be missing important concepts, and we maybe need to enrich the theoretical structure. So one thing that we did, for example, was look at what we called kosha chakra intersections. If you think of chakras as energy centers along the vertical axis of the body, and the koshas as layers cutting across the chakras, then we get 35 chakra kosha intersections, each with its own distinctive definition. Let me just give you a quick example of that so it's clear. So for example, 1-5, which would be the root chakra combined with the Anandamaya layer. The intersection of the root chakra and the Andamaya kosha represents the spiritual and existential peace that comes from feeling deeply connected and secure in the world. It embodies the bliss that arises from a profound sense of grounding and connection to the earth. So the reference to the earth is specific there to this particular definition. Okay, so we have 35 definitions of these that have been arrived at through a mixture of basically conceptual analysis and reading texts and talking to teachers and so on. When we put that into AI and ask it to classify these experiences in terms of these chakra kosha intersections, we see some interesting patterns. So for example, again, in the bottom left, very, very, very clear signal of ajna activation for DMT, but now we see it's actually quite localized to the bliss layer, kosha number 5. In contrast, in the top right, if we look at the heat map for cocaine, we see that perhaps intuitively as expected, there's a lot of activation on the third chakra, the solar chakra, but also it's geared more to the upper koshas. So we see that not everything is down at the bliss layer. Similarly, we see that MDMA again peaks on the heart chakra, but also we see substantial activation on the sacral chakra, but also some others as well. Like we see some activation here in the throat chakra. Okay, so as I said, we have these definitions. Let me give you this one as well. Actually, I'll skip that for now because I think we might be running out of a little bit of time. One last thing I wanted to mention was that in the data that we're seeing, we may be seeing some patterns corresponding to concepts that we were not even really paying attention to or was not in our definitions. For example, these patterns in the data that we see here may correspond to the grantis, the Brahma Granti, Vishnu Granti, and Rudra Granti. We can talk more about that if you want. I mention all of this just to give you a sense of the kind of uncertainty that we're dealing with and the sort of the different angles that we're exploring, the ways we're trying to approach this research. And maybe that will inspire you to let us know of some approaches that we should be considering that we're not already. All right, and with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon, for this very interesting presentation. We are going to start the session of questions and answers. So we have our first question by Alejandro. Would you mind unmuting yourself? I don't know if Alejandro is still there.
Unmute. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Sorry, I just lost my audio. I just missed everything in that transition. Sorry about that.
I understand. Yeah, well, it happens in life. It's okay. I just wasn't being allowed to unmute. That's why I delayed.
Okay.
So I'm playing a little bit the devil's advocate here, but I think I want to bring to your attention a certain issue. And I'm sorry if I'm taking a little longer time, but this is a very fundamental thing. Your research, things that you mention, clearly speak to a corporal topology of the psyche, which of course correlates directly with the concept of chakras and the practices related to it. However, I have a specific question for you, which I wrote and I will read it aloud. I don't know, everybody seems to enjoy my accent, but anyway, I will do it. From your exposition, and please remember that I wrote this some 60% in your exposition, okay? So some things you said later may qualify or refine this, okay? So from your exposition, I gathered that you treat the chakras as objective fixed features of for the lack of a better word, energetic anatomy of human beings. It is, you treat them as descriptive in nature, as if we all had been born with an energetic body and chakras in it as organs of sort. Something I shall comment that, say, the followers of Gurdjieff would contest energetically. And true, postulating that we are just mere machines or molds in which an energetic body may potentially arise, which relates to some postulates of traditional Tantrism, but I'll leave that to you to elaborate if you want. Did you consider that this approach or this assumption may be a flaw in your method, at least in as much as you intend to rely on authentic living traditions, something you reference a number of times, trying to engage respectfully and from within with different traditions, right? Since chakras are not descriptions, but rather prescriptions, it is guides for construing visualizations topologically situated in the body. And no doubt you're aware of that even within Tantrism, its different schools, there are multiple chakra systems. In other words, it is my contention that the descriptive approach of the chakras, which seems to pervade modern discourse about them, is the result of theosophical, neo-tantra and new age influences, not a root concept of traditional tantra as far as I know it. And I invite you to elaborate on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a really important point, and it's something we've been thinking about, this distinction between the chakras being prescriptive or descriptive. So first of all, I hope this was clear maybe towards as the talk progressed, that we're kind of treating these as like models. So we're not committed to anyone being the absolute truth of, say, the anatomy of the human energetic system. So across the traditions and across the different chakra systems, we see these as different models or hypotheses that we can compare and contrast and see if they suit particular purposes, so long as we define what those purposes are. The prescriptive descriptive thing is quite tricky because it's at least from my understanding, and I'm happy to be completely corrected on this, it's a little bit like how the human physical body arrives in this reality. Like we arrive with legs and arms and so on, but they're not developed, and they have to grow, and then they can change in shape and function over the course of a lifetime. And there's various prescriptive elements, right? Like knowing how to exercise, knowing how to do yoga and so on, creates a better body, more flexibility and so on. And so we could see the chakra systems in very much the same way. And so rather than testing hypotheses about descriptions, we could be thinking about this as testing hypotheses about prescriptions, right? If you employ one particular prescription strategy, what kinds of results do you get relative to the purposes you define, and compare that with another prescriptive system. So that testing approach can work at this descriptive level or the prescriptive level. From what I can understand, I think both are at play. It's partly a descriptive thing and partly a normative one as well, partly descriptive. This actually happens in epistemology or formal epistemology. A similar sort of thing happens where we have belief states or knowledge states or degrees of belief in the case of probabilities. There's a descriptive element to these theories where we say, okay, this is how the human mind is built. It has beliefs, and desires, knowledge, and so on. And then we say how those things ought to be, like your belief shouldn't be consistent, your belief should be consistent, right? So we have these prescriptive techniques as well. So I see it a little bit like that.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
We'd like to call on Shailendra, Dr. Shailendra Singh, to ask a question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Am I audible?
Yes, you're welcome.
Our first question is that we have in Hinduism the two understanding of term prana. One is from Patanjali Yoga, the definition of prana, and one is from Tantric tradition. So,
I'm sorry,
what is your...
Sorry to interrupt, but it's hard to hear you.
Can you define me the concept of prana? Prana.
So your audio, I don't know if it's the case for everyone else, but your audio is cracking up a lot, and I can only catch every second word.
If I can help, I think Dr. Shailendra is asking you to elaborate on the concept of prana, because there is a difference in the way Patanjali defines it versus the way Tantra defines prana. I think that's the question.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I've just realized it's my audio. Hold on one sec. Let me see if I can fix it real quick. All right. Could you please repeat?
I'm asking about the concept of prana.
Yes.
Which has been explored by one in a way in Patanjali Yoga and in another way in the Tantric philosophy. What is your position?
My position on prana? Okay, so you're on mute, but I'm assuming that's correct. I don't have a position on prana. So as I said, because we're engaged in this engineering project, we're looking to these different traditions and seeing what could work. So potentially we can borrow from both, or we may go one way. So that outcome would emerge from that peace framework, where we're going through, trying out different ideas and testing them out.
Next, we have Nanda Vaidya. If you could please unmute.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Hi,
Aidan.
Anand.
Great job. How you doing?
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I guess that maybe mine is more of a comment from my perspective that I think could help alleviate maybe some of the ways in which people might be thinking what's going on. And it has a lot to do with what you just said, which I think is a common misunderstanding of what we're trying to do. And not even just us, what generally some people in our penumbra are trying to do. So even if we might think that Aidan and I are quite far along in our research, or the Mystical Entropy Project is quite far along, if you look at how Aidan carefully laid out the structure of the piece format, it's completely an evolving, dynamic, revisable format. The idea is that as we learn more from speaking to people specifically about definitions, let's just take prana and Tantra versus prana and Patanjali, as we learn more about that, we will then refine in greater detail through interaction with the other elements of our methodology, such as analysis and greater empirical testing, an engineered concept. But in the beginning, the idea is to cast the net very wide so that what we have is an inclusive group of co-inquirers who can help us have a better foundation for building the thing that we're ultimately going to engineer. So we think that the precision of the concept that we come up with at the end is a function of the inputs and the quality of the people and the practices that we inquire and engage with. So I very much doubt that Aidan himself or myself would be so confident about the intersection even between the chakras and the koshas at this stage, because we have to talk to a deal of people and look at more textual evidence through textual scholars who can help us understand appropriate translations of this. So the movement to move from something that's written in Sanskrit to something that can be used effectively in an fMRI study or in a cognitive science paradigm is actually quite an elaborate thing. I actually worked with the Berkeley group for a long time on what they were doing with various forms of meditation and testing it in different lab settings. And I learned very quickly that the movement from the Sanskrit texts that they were looking at and what they would end up being as verifiable or testable hypotheses in terms of a lab setting took quite a while. So I think just to emphasize something that Aidan laid out, the piece format and cross-cultural conceptual engineering is a process of refinement towards a concept, which then itself, even if that becomes the one that we're using and publishing, can itself be revised through further sort of investigation. So Aidan, I was just wanting to clarify that aspect. I hope that's consistent with what you think also, and you can comment on it if you want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Beautiful. I completely agree, of course.
Maldakalji, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Adam. Am I audible?
Hello? Yes, hi.
A very nice presentation. Yeah. Two quick question. I'm still interested, but I don't know much about the idea. You showed there's a lot of MDMA, like LSD, those activation chakra. How do you is this data like qualitative or it is a quantitative? Like where that bar graph is coming from? Is coming from this all those you said you asked to the AI, right? It
Yes.
might be biased to those a lot of those junk writing on the internet, or is there is a specific data from it? And the second question is, I'm not aware of. I'm also in the science field, actually in the neuroscience field. But is there somewhere some kinds of evidence that anatomically located the chakras, some set of measurement are available? Maybe I'm not aware of the recent data on it. Can you throw some light on it?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. For the first one, the data was qualitative. So we had people who have just written out their experiences and posted them on this website, erowid.org. And this website had been collecting those experiences for decades. So there's thousands of them. And then I think the intuition behind that was that people's descriptions of these experiences of all these different drugs, all these diverse people, that would be valuable. But it's hard to know how to analyze that. And then now with AI, what we can do is we can give AI the description of an experience and ask for it to reflect on everything that happened in an experience and what might have been happening to the chakra system of that person as they were going through the experience. And so then it would, and then we gave it, so in some cases we gave it no definition of chakras, and sometimes we gave it our own definitions. The results were pretty robust. Because basically, like, if you take MDMA as an example, people very, very, very frequently have experiences involving love and empathy and connection. And so the machine sees all that and says, oh, these are qualities that we associate with the heart chakra. So that's how that works. And so then through doing that many, many, many times and doing statistics over those verdicts, you can think of them as like grades. You know, we'd grade a student's essay, A, B, C, D, E. We grade an experience as a chakra. And then we do that many times and we do statistics over it and then we get those results.
So
regarding the, oh, yeah, go ahead.
is like, if somebody feeling love, is not that some ion channels opening in the brain, rather you're associating with this is some heart chakra, right? It's a qualitatively association.
Yeah, and this actually gets to your next question. There's a subtle issue about where we would locate the heart chakra, right? So the thought is that if people, so we know that certain brain networks, there's certain changes in neural activity and functional connectivity associated with experiences like profound love, right? Or mental imagery. We know what those look like. And so the thought is when people are having these experiences, either with drugs or with meditations, we should see the similar kinds of networks activate or change in their connectivity structure.
So far there is not a kind of either like a, the group of neurons or like some sort of nucleus. As you see in the brain, there are different nucleus. There is no so-called centers anatomically so far we have found. Is that right?
So to my knowledge, that hasn't been found. And I would guess that most likely that what we'd be finding is brain networks rather than local anatomical regions.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's probably more about functional connectivity than anatomy.
Krishna Sarma, would you like to ask your question, please?
I'm sorry, my video is not working. Am I audible, madam?
Yes. Hi.
My doubt is ketamine is normally a painkiller, as you told.
It is normally
a painkiller and one kind of anesthesiatic drug. How it will work after the solar plexus? How heart chakra, Ajna chakra, and the other chakra, final chakra, how it is going to act on those things?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but it looks like what's happening is that
how is it going to work on those things?
How's it going to work on the upper chakras?
Upper chakras, higher chakras.
Yeah, so the short answer is we don't know. We've only just seen these results. So all we've seen is this sort of the change in pattern, where the lower chakras were reduced and the higher chakras were increased. Now, why that's happening is currently unclear. Is it energizing the upper ones and deactivating the lower ones, or is it merely deactivating the lower ones and allowing prana to rise to the top ones? Or maybe it's energizing the top ones and drawing prana away from the low ones. So the actual mechanism, we're just nowhere near to finding that out at this stage.
No, my doubt is, since it is an anesthetic drug, anesthesia, it is giving the anesthesia to the body, your mind will not function at that time. If your mind is not functioning, how in the higher chakras you will realize the things?
Yes, well, extreme ketamine doses can completely, shut down the body. But a lot of people take more milder doses of ketamine, and it's not completely shut down, and they're fully conscious. And in fact, a lot of people report having profound meditative experiences in the ketamine state, perhaps because it's actually reducing all the noise, all the emotional turmoil that's coming from the other chakras.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, Suresh Krishna has a question. Suresh, would you like to ask your question? Okay, otherwise we can ask for you. Suresh asks, I assume that your AI model tried to find correspondences between the word descriptions in Arrowhead and some word-based properties of the chakra. If yes, what was the source of the word list for the chakras? If not, how was the mapping done?
Yeah, so we started with just at the standardized, popularized 7 chakra system. So what seems to be the case is that a lot of tantric language is embedded in English. So people speak about, speaking from the bottom of the heart, or feeling something in the body, or having a closed heart. They speak in this sort of way, or the associations with strength and determination and so on with the core. So since those patterns are in language, people seem to naturally pick up on them when they're describing their experiences, and then those patterns are picked up by this sort of popularized chakra system. But as I mentioned, we also looked at the chakra kosha intersections, and so we drew those definitions from more traditional texts. But at the moment, what it's really been is really exploring different definitions and seeing which ones might be creating stronger signals and clearer pictures of the phenomena that we're studying. Does that answer your question?
Ravi, would you want to ask your question, please?
I don't hear anything.
Hi. So I think there's probably 2 things that are worth disentangling. One of which is, yes, there are these different types of systems, right? So, and I mean, I know people knock on the 7 system, but I mean, Kubjika has a very similar system. But I think the real concern is actually how these things are understood. So with the peace model, there's this feedback loop of, well, we'll do verification and we'll do testing. But I think that's to some degree to really misunderstand what these things are in the first place is that they're enacted. And I think Alejandro was kind of getting at this as well, which is that, the correspondences that people talk about and that you programmed into your AI, I mean, these are Carl Jung, like these are really recent, Theosophists and Carl Jung. If you actually look back into these systems, the chakras are obviously locations, and you can install any number of deities. You can install any number of elements on them. So people say something like, oh, well, the Muladhara is for Earth. Well, that's in one system, but you can install any number of different things on there. So I think the premise or the motor of like your peace model, and I think Anand talked about this as well, is, well, we'll get all this diversity in and we'll test things and we'll figure it out and we'll have this recursion. But I don't know how there's going to be the recursion if these practices aren't trying to get to some sort of fundamental truth, but are using these as upayas, as methods to realize very different things. So I guess that's the question is, if you recognize that the ontology underlying at least Shaiva Tantra is about bhavana, it's about practices that enact, practices that create. They're not things that discover, they're not things that find existing correspondences. That's the use of imagination. I don't know how then this feedback loop of peace would actually function, because we're using these things for different purposes in the context of different practices. And I think that's where the language of verification, of testing, of so on and so forth, doesn't fit with how these practices function in a authentic, actual context. So I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit to that more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to find our own programming of our own chakra system, right? So we've worked with the popularized one because it's so common and it's just out there. But the idea is that it doesn't have to be that one. As I mentioned, there's the Vajrayana system, or there's all sorts of systems. So the question is, if we think these things are valuable to have, so as the West is sort of continuing to become more familiar with psychedelics and meditation and all these other practices, do they need do we need an energetic framework? I would argue that we would benefit a lot from having one. And then the question is, so then, well, how do we get that framework? We can't just, it doesn't seem like we can just copy paste from some tradition. It seems like we have to create a new one. And to do that, we've got to work with something. And there seems to be some seed intuitions in our culture that correspond to kind of like proto-chakras, right? Love is associated with the chest area. Thinking and insight is associated up here, right? So we have like what you could think of as very crude or proto-chakra concepts that then through this piece framework, we could build on that, bootstrap, make it more precise and systematize it and then create our own system.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if I'm hearing you right, actually what you're doing is largely to kind of base it off of the way maybe like American language system is, find the metaphors and pull it out that way. And then of course that's not going to align at anything of necessarily the original tantric models, because they have very different assumptions and very different backgrounds. So I guess maybe what you're trying to do is to take assumptions that are baked into Western language and then try to identify it, like map it onto the body or map it onto traditional chakra locations that way. Would that be correct?
Yes. And,
okay.
and we can map it into any system, right? Because these people who have described their experiences, they may know something about chakras, but it's not in those reports, right? They're oblivious. They didn't know a philosopher was going to come along with AI and chakras, right? So there's nothing like explicit about chakras in there. It's just people talking about their experiences. And so we use the popularized 7 system, but we could do anything else. And then what we could do then is compare different systems. Like, are some systems more effective, say, for example, supporting trauma therapy, right? So there's a lot of trauma in the world right now that's being treated with MDMA. There's a lot of trauma therapists. Which energy frameworks do they think are effective? And so we can incorporate those and test them and explore and then see like what the data says, which ones tend to be most effective for people, say, turning up to trauma therapy in the West. Thank you.
I believe Professor Anand Baidia has a point. I'd like to join back conversation.
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, I wanted to respond a bit to Ravi's comment because I think he presented a version of how to evaluate peace and the recursion within it that depended on the exact assumption that we don't have in the model, which is that it's a descriptive model under recursion. It's an engineering model under recursion. So your assumption to show that we would falsify the ontology or that we would run afoul of certain assumptions in any one given tradition or in the base, assume that the output product of the recursion is descriptive, but it's not descriptive. The whole point of cross-cultural conceptual engineering is to engineer a new concept on the basis of cross-cultural investigation where we're sensitive to the variation in the ontologies and the different systems, and then to see what works in terms of a scientific context, building forward for some specific purpose. Aidan sort of went with the therapeutic one, but there could be other ones we want to go for, so the model is plastic in that way. So I would think that preserving authentically any one tradition textually under the interpretation of a specific subset of Sanskrit interpreters of that tradition is not a goal of this process. Rather, it's to be sensitive to that variation in the production and the engineering of something that could be useful now for some further purpose, which may not have been the identical purpose of any one given tradition. So I think your critique is correct, but it's typically the kind of critique I see when people do a critique of what we called conceptual analysis, which is not cross-cultural, but individualistic and only done in the West, but rather under the model that I built, what we're doing is cross-cultural conceptual engineering, right? So that's the way I would see the difference. Aidan might have some differences, but that's just the response I wanted to give quickly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anand. I agree.
Okay, we'd like to call on Deepti to ask a question.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
can you please elaborate a bit on chakra and kosha intersection? Because as the energy rises upwards, initially one may not, the root chakra might not have the intersection with Anandamaya kosha. But as the energy rises upward, then the intersection one goes deeper, and the intersection may happen with the Vijnanamaya kosha or the Anandamaya kosha. So in your understanding, how it works? If the root chakra is activated, immediately is it connected with the Anandamaya kosha? As per my understanding and experience, it may not.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is I thank you so much for this question, because it's precisely why I included that as an example, that intersection of the root chakra and Anandamaya, because I think it's quite counterintuitive. I think we normally think that there's a particular kind of sort of sequence of connections between the koshas and chakras, and energy has to rise before we get to the bliss layer. So this is why I mention it, because it's exactly the kind of question that we have. Do we work with a system like that, or do we work with, well, conceptually, if we just think about what these layers are and what these chakras are, they should intersect each other.
They intersect.
Yes, and then if they all intersect each other, then we have these 35 things to define. And when we do that, at least like on the way that we've done it so far, what we were able to do was get, like, one nice benefit from that was what we were able to get 7 kinds of spiritual or mystical experience that are often not distinguished in the literature, corresponding to the Anandamaya layer for each of the chakras. So the root chakra one was a spiritual experience where you're experiencing a profound groundedness or connection with the earth, right? Or the throat chakra one, this is another counterintuitive one. So throat chakra with Anandamaya could be understood as sort of the blissfulness through harmonic communication with others, with yourself, with God, and so on. It's different from just regular, say, communication, speaking and listening. So it's an open question. Like we don't have a belief about this. What we're doing is we're exploring these different ways of using these concepts and combining them, and seeing what they do, seeing what kinds of results that we get, and then from that, we would engineer a system. But it's too early to draw any conclusions about what that system would look like.
So let's say the Kundalini awakens, and one root chakra and the rises till heart chakra, let's say, but it hasn't reached the crown chakra, Sahasrara. Will one it's still at sacral? Will one experience bliss at sacral? Because the layers, my question is the rising upward and the penetration among the koshas, is it simultaneous?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, because we don't have data that would answer that question yet. But in theory, we could find that out, right? So on the
I found this on the web. In theory, we could find that out. Check it out.
What was that? Okay, so
he came up. You said something, and Siri was activated and listened.
Okay, what was I saying? Yeah, so on this system. So according to the system, you should think is not as our belief system, but as a possibility that we're exploring. On that system, you can experience bliss at the sacral chakra, because that would be sacral and Anandamaya.
Maybe everyone will have a different experience in that, because the rise of the Shakti is different, brings out different experiences, and how it depends on the past karmic tendencies and experiences also.
Absolutely, that's a really important point, because there's so much individual variation. Like in the data that we see, we have to do statistics to see the signals. So that's an important point to emphasize.
We can't generalize it in terms of this everyone would have, in this case, very individual experience.
Yes, exactly. That's why I likened it to a genetic code. So yeah, our genes determine a lot about us, but not everything. There's so much about us depends on, from a scientific perspective, obviously, our culture, our family upbringing, our environment, our diet, all these sorts of things.
And you're doing a good job to explain it scientifically. Is a
thank you.
task to be
Trying my
understood.
best. Thank you very much.
We have a question by Ajit Kati. He says, in my dissertation that on the meditation on Omkara, I concluded based on some psychological experiments and from which I can get the empirical results of meditation up to Vijnana Maya Kosha, or when one reaches the level of Ananda Maya Koshas, that experience can be comprehended empirically once the result of that experiment. My question is, by looking at the hypothesis, are we able to empirically observe or evaluate the experience of the practitioner who is meditating on the crown chakra?
Yeah, so the thought is yes. We haven't done that though. So the experiment that we're going to be, this is maybe a nice thing to talk about. The experiment that we're currently planning that the meditation will be on the heart chakra and the ajna, the third eye chakra. And we're also considering doing the heart chakra and the sacral chakra at the same time. And the thought is that pairing of heart and sacral will be more similar to the signals that we get from the MDMA, fMRI data, than the heart chakra alone and ajna chakra alone. So we've picked those because of to simplify the design, and because we think there's a strong difference and likely to get a strong signal for those. If we can do that, then obviously we would want to do this for all the chakras, and we would include the crown.
I think that's the last question. So thank you so much, Dr. Lyon.
Thank you very
Acharya
much.
Ji, would you like to close?
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon. Very insightful. The vision of Vimarsha is to have an open, objective analysis to all these shastric, mystical experiences that comes along our lines, and I welcome your support for future endeavors.
Thank you very much.
Ya srishtihi srashturadya vahati vidyutam ya havir ya chahotri yadve kalam vidhattah sruti vishaya guna ya stita vyapya vishwam ya mahu sarva bija prakriti ritiyaya praninaha pranavantah pratyakshavi prasannastanuviravatu astabhirashtabhirishaha.